My name is Paul Adamson. I'm going to be your chairman for this opening plenary session. Before I introduce the speakers, I just wanted, on a personal note, pay tribute to Richard Howard over there, who's still in the room, because it is the end of an era. He's leaving the European Parliament after 22 years, and he'll be sorely missed. And all good causes need a good champion, especially in the European Parliament. And this is a very good cause, and Richard has been not just a good, but an outstanding champion. So good luck, Richard, in your new career. I'm sure we'll stay in touch on this, very much so. My job this morning is actually to be basically a traffic cop. I have a vague reason why I'm here, because I'm on the advisory group of the Purpose of the Corporation project, but I have to admit I've done practically nothing in that capacity, because the people involved don't need people like me to advise them how to conduct their research and advocacy. But I'm still proud to say I'm on the advisory group of the Purpose of the Corporation project nonetheless. So traffic cop means, first of all, I introduce John Kay, who'll make a presentation for about 20 minutes. John, I'm told to be quite stern, if I may, because we haven't got that much time. And then in short order, turn the discussion over to Susanne and to Marcello, who will react briefly as well. And then depending on the mood, what kind of sentiment I pick up from the room will engage you as well. I'll let you rather just listen to the panel and be a passive audience, fine. We'll just carry on talking amongst ourselves. If you want to be more engaged and take part in the broader discussion, simply wave your hand and we'll make sure that you take part in the discussion afterwards. John Kay needs no introduction for two reasons. First of all, there's a bio in the pack anyway, so I won't waste anybody's time. But more importantly, he's an extremely distinguished and well-known thinker and writer and thought leader, basically, on this and many related topics. So without further ado, Professor John Kay, over to you, sir.
This talk is going to be a little bit of a historical tour, and it will start by going back 20 years to 1996. And for those of you who are in the audience from Britain, you may remember that that was when the Conservative government was dragging towards its inevitable end. A young, fresh-faced leader of the opposition called Tony Blair was Prime Minister in waiting. And I was asked to go to the Confederation of British Industry conference, the British Employers Association conference in Harrogate, to talk about stakeholding. Because Blair had delivered a speech on stakeholding, I might claim some measure of authorship of some of the ideas in that speech. And the question was asked, what is it that stakeholding is actually about? What should we be paying attention to? And the way I framed that discussion was to take two statements from ICI, which was then Britain's largest industrial company, as it had been for most of the 20th century. And one was drawn from ICI's annual report in the 1980s. And what it said was this: ICI aims to be the world's leading chemical company, servicing our customers internationally through the innovative and responsible application of chemistry and related sciences. Through achievement of our aim, we will enhance the wealth and well-being of our shareholders, our employees, our customers, and the communities which we serve and in which we operate. That was from the ICI annual report of 1988, and I contrasted it with the equivalent statement in the ICI annual report from 1994. And the statement in 1994 ran as follows: our objective is to maximize value for our shareholders by focusing on businesses where we have market leadership, a technological edge, and a world competitive cost base. You can easily notice a variety of differences between these two statements. One is that the first embraces a variety of stakeholders. The second refers exclusively to shareholders. One is that the first looks forward to the responsible application of chemistry and related sciences to business. The other focuses on businesses, i.e. existing businesses, where we have market leadership and a technological edge and a competitive cost base. And I said what this view is about is saying the role of corporations in society is defined by the first of these statements, not the second. That was, it seemed to me, the debate which one needed to have. As you know, the idea of stakeholding died as the face of Tony Blair became rather fresh-faced and the hair became slightly less and rather grey. And it died in a variety of issues. It died with the death of the Clinton-Blair kind of discussion of the late 90s about the third way, a project which still needs to be advanced, which is the project of reconciling the center-left of European and American politics with the inevitability of a market economy. That's, in a sense, the project in which we are all, of which everything that is going on today is part. It died also in Britain on a variety of other issues, the inevitable feuds between Blair and Brown, and on the idea that stakeholding was about having a very large number of trade union representatives on the boards of companies, an idea which aroused enthusiasm on the part of nobody except the prospective trade union representatives themselves. But it's worth going back a little more into history and looking at that ICI as it was under that first mission statement. The company that aimed to be the world's leading chemical company through the innovative and responsible application of chemistry and related sciences and business. ICI was formed in 1926 from a merger of other UK companies, and its initial strengths were in dye-stuffs and explosives. These were not markets that were going places in the 1920s, and ICI then perceived that actually it was in petrochemicals of various kinds, both heavy petroleum products and new products such as artificial fibers, that the future of chemistry and business lay. After the Second World War, the senior management of ICI made a very prescient judgment, which was that the real future of chemistry and business was actually not in either of these things, it was in pharmacology. And they recruited an able team of young academic chemists to develop a pharmaceutical business. It was a pharmaceutical business which lost money for 2 decades, from the late 1940s through to the 1960s. But in the 1960s, the company developed, it was discovered by a group of scientists led by James Black, to whom I'll come back, developed a drug called, drugs called beta blockers, which were actually the first effective drugs against hypertension. The pharmaceutical business turned into profit, and by the late 80s, it was pharmacology that was essentially the driver of the growth and profitability of the company. How did the mission statements I described change? Well, the real catalyst was that in the early 90s, there was a rather vague threat to the company by an aggressive British conglomerate then called Hanson Trust. And Hanson, it was thought, might make a hostile bid for the company. That galvanized the ICI board to focus on shareholder value. They demerged the pharmaceutical business, reasoning that it would be valued more highly as a standalone business than as part of a conglomerate, and the rump of the company, the chemicals business, was left at ICI. And at first it worked. When I gave that talk in 1996, ICI's share price was at an all-time high. And actually it peaked at the same moment that New Labour peaked in the spring of 1997. From 1997, for the next 7 or 8 years, ICI's share price began a steady decline. The company, as it focused on businesses in which it had competitive advantage, cost leadership, and so on, decided to divest itself of some of its old businesses, buy a collection of new businesses, and it found it a lot easier to do the second at fancy prices than it did to do the first. By 2006, ICI, 10 years after I gave that talk, ICI had essentially failed. In 2007, it was taken, the rump of it was taken over by AkzoNobel, the Dutch company. 2006 was a significant year. in another sense in the UK, because of the passage of a new Companies Act. A new Companies Act, which, as most of you will know in Britain, says that the duty of directors of a company is to promote the success of the company for the benefit of the shareholders, for the benefit of the members, taking account of a variety of other interests. It's not an accident that it's framed that way. It says to promote the success of the company, and that promoting the company will be for the benefit of the members. And that is the way it is, and that is the way it is intended to be. The company, the new ICI, that was dedicated to the creation of shareholder value, turned out in the end not to have created very much of that. In fact, it destroyed virtually all the shareholder value which had been created in the present generation, in previous generations. And it wasn't exceptional in that. In 2008, the global financial crisis, one of the companies that disappeared in the course of that was Bear Stearns, a company which famously had above its trading floor, "We make nothing but money." If you make nothing but money, in the end, you don't make much of that. And the reason for that is clear and straightforward. It is that if you run a commercial organization as a purely instrumental organization, then in the end you are destroyed, as organizations like Bear Stearns and Lehman are, by the self-interest of your own employees. And that was what prompted me to write in 2010 a little book which some of you may have seen called Obliquity, which featured, among other things, the profit-seeking paradox that the most successful companies in generating profits are not actually generally the most profit-oriented of companies. And the title of that book, Obliquity, was paradoxically given to me by James Black, the man who discovered beta blockers at ICI. And in a conversation with him, I wanted to pursue the question of why, after discovering beta blockers, he had left ICI in order to work for another British chemical company. And he said, the reason for that was very simple. After beta blockers, what ICI wanted me to do was go on road shows selling beta blockers. And that wasn't, he said, what interested me. What interested me was discovering new drugs. So he actually went to another British drug company called SmithKline, where he then invented another drug called Tagamet, which became a blockbuster-selling anti-ulcerant and made first SmithKline and then Glaxo into major world pharmaceutical businesses. In fact, James Black probably created more shareholder value than anyone in the history of British business. And he said to me in the course of that conversation, I used to tell my colleagues that at ICI, that if they wanted to make money, there were a lot easier ways of doing it than drug research. And then he shook his head and said, "How wrong could I have been?" I think of it as the principle of obliquity, that complex goals are often best achieved when they're not actually pursued directly. And so it is, and so it was. When I talked about that history, 10 years later in 2006, at a different event, I got a pained letter the following week from ICI, the company. And the pained letter said roughly, "We may have screwed up our business over the last 10 years, but we did a great job on corporate social responsibility." The letter carried with it, you've all seen these brochures. I'm sure some of you have actually written these brochures. It was a brochure about ICI's record in corporate social responsibility. It was printed on recycled paper. It had the requisite photographs illustrating the diversity of ICI's workforce, and it proclaimed the no doubt admirable things ICI had done in reducing the toxicity of its paints and other chemicals. But this really was not the point. The point was about the purpose of the corporation. And the purpose of the corporation is not about adopting non-business goals. The purpose of the corporation is not about having good structures of corporate governance. We all know that Royal Bank of Scotland ticked every formal box on corporate governance with a double tick. This is about what companies think themselves and what they do for themselves. And we need to pick up the point which Richard made in his introduction, that it's about how the company views itself, not about the rules which we impose on it from outside. In a sense, when Milton Friedman said notoriously back in the 1970s that the business of business is business, he was absolutely right. The business of business is business. It is not political action, and indeed political action by corporations is one of the largest dangers we have today to the effective functioning of the market economy. Corporate rent-seeking is actually one of the great scourges of our time, and it's as much a scourge in Brussels today as it is a scourge in Washington. We need to focus back on the idea that the business of business is business, and the job of business people is to build great businesses. And the truth is, this is what the majority of people who work in business actually want to do, and in the main do. We're in this paradoxical situation where over the last 2 or 3 decades, we've created a rhetoric of shareholder value, a legitimization, a public legitimization of greed, which is a dialogue about how market economies function, which succeeds in being both repulsive. It means that market forces have become in many circles a term of abuse. It succeeds in being repulsive and actually false as a description of how effective capitalism actually functions. The truth is, the job of business, of business people, is to create great businesses. This is what the majority of people in business want to do, and it's what a very high proportion of them are actually doing. And if you ask what is a great business, then we all know what a great business is. Frankly, if you need to be told what a great business is, you shouldn't be running a business any more than someone who needs to be told what a good school or a good hospital and given targets about what a good school and a good hospital is someone who should be running a school or a hospital. It is the job of people who are running these organizations to find out what these good organizations actually are, and in the main, it is not very difficult. Apple and Google, we know, are great businesses. They're great businesses because customers love their products. They're great businesses because they make lots of money for their investors. They're great businesses because they're great businesses which do things wrong from time to time. We have a major problem with both these companies in relation to their tax affairs, for example. But we all do things that are wrong from time to time, and we need social and societal expectations that push them back into line, as I hope we do in these areas. The employees of these companies love working for them. It is perfectly true that some Apple products, many Apple products, are made in China in conditions which we in this room would certainly not like our daughters to be working in. And we need to ask, what are the obligations of a company like that in relation to that? And I believe what they are is not to export any particular set of Western or Apple or any other values or employment practices there, but actually to behave well in terms of local expectations and local conditions in order to ensure that these communities, like every communities which that companies touches, are better off as a result of their activities. So what is the purpose of business? The purpose of business is defined by that ICI mission statement. It is to make products people want. It is to make money for investors. It is to provide a satisfying work environment for the people who live there. And above all, it is to leave all the communities in which they operate better rather than worse off as a result of their activities. I don't think that's particularly profound. I don't think it's particularly difficult. It's just what we mean by good business. And the reason we've got away from that kind of dialogue is described in my description of what had happened at ICI. Because the truth is, we would not have been having this discussion 30 or 40 years ago, because at that time the people who ran these great corporations regarded being responsible for these corporations as a responsibility. I've never forgotten a session I taught at LBS where I brought in a retired chief executive from one of these great British companies who said to me at the end of the session, "You know, John, these kids regard being head of a large corporation as a prize rather than a responsibility." And that describes exactly the change which occurred across that era of shareholder value. But that era of shareholder value, I think, is today at an end. Many people say it began with Jack Welch's famous speech at the Pierre Hotel in 1981, soon after he'd taken over as CEO of General Electric, in which he defined the objectives of General Electric in terms not very different to those in the second of these ICI mission statements. But it was 25 years later, retired from GE after the global financial crisis of 2009, that Jack Welch said that shareholder value was the dumbest idea in the world, and he was right. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, John. Before I turn to Susanne and Marcello to react and give their own views on what you just said, I'd like to ask you a quick question, if I may. Listening to you speak, you said, when talking about RBS, they ticked all the boxes. So the issue is not about rules, it's about the kind of corporate culture as a key factor in how companies behave and perform. But then, especially in this town, it's a town which loves making rules, and companies have to abide by rules. So the rules are there as well, we can't ignore them. And then thirdly, you talked about also, when talking about tax specifically, in Apple and Google, for example, societal expectations need to be there to push back. So you need the three, don't you? You need the kind of internal dynamic of a company culture. You need some kind of rules-based system externally imposed. And then finally, the outside world, putting some kind of amorphous pressure. But how do these things come together in a dynamic process?
You're right, of course, you need all of these things. And you're also right when you say the trouble is in a town like this, or in a town like London, when I write a report on short-term and long-termism, people want to say, what rules can we write that will change behavior? And actually, there are very few rules that people can write that will change behavior in this kind of way. We need to engage much more in an educational process. One of the most notable things in all of this, I mentioned the 2006 Companies Act in the UK, which perhaps redefined, perhaps codified what the responsibility of directors is. I've encountered many directors who actually noticed that, or indeed know what it is. I still have, yet again and again, the experience of talking to people in British companies who say, of course, the legal duty of directors is to maximise value for shareholders. And when I ask, oh, what law is that? Where does it come from? I have never had a convincing answer.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm going to be very old-fashioned and turn to Susanne first, the lady on the panel, to react. You're from the business world, NovoNordisk, a well-known pharmaceutical company, which was sort of indirectly referenced by John in his presentation. Your sector obviously is very much a key sector when it comes to this broad area. So your reaction to John, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this project. I was proudly part of the initial discussions in Brussels, where Richard was also a speaker. And for me, this is in fact an event that helps connect some of the many dots of what we are involved with. So I could give you a speech about what a great company NovoNordisk is, but I think I will spare you that, and then instead ask you a question. So how many of you have started a business or been involved in starting a business? So let me ask you, did you do that to maximize shareholder value? Or, and this of course is a leading question, did you do it because you felt that that business was serving an unmet need out there? Yeah. So I think that would be the premise I would take, is that when we create great businesses, we do so because the business is serving a need in society. So in the case of NovoNordisk, that need is providing treatment to people who have diabetes. And I need to give you a little bit, of course, of context with NovoNordisk, also because we were introduced to the pharmaceutical sector. So when this company was formed in 1923, this was to serve the needs of patients who had a very rare disease at the time, diabetes. And if they did not get this insulin, a gift to humanity as it was presented at the time, they would literally die. Since then, much has changed, and now we see that diabetes is growing at epidemic rates. We have more than 500 million people with diabetes around the world. And so with that, NovoNordisk, as one of the early movers in this space, has grown as well. So we have grown over the last 15 years from a medium-sized company to a major pharmaceutical company. And that does something to the identity of a company, because all of a sudden we are big pharma. So we have a different responsibility and a different role and a different influence. But what has guided us throughout is really that inherent, what you were mentioning, that inherent sense of purpose. So why are we here? And we have framed it in modern language as saying that we are here to defeat diabetes and other serious chronic conditions. So in essence, we are in business to put ourselves out of business, because that has to be the purpose of a pharmaceutical company, is to find that way of dealing with the serious problems. We are also measured by financial terms as very successful business. So we have a CEO who took office in the year 2000, and during his tenure, and please note, it has been a tenure for 16 years. He has now announced that he is stepping down at the end of this year. So over 16 years, he has more than quadrupled the value of the shares. So is the market cap, is that the best proxy for a successful business? Well, if you ask Wall Street, they would say yes. If you ask others in this room, they would probably challenge it and say, well, it depends on how you earn that money and how you spend it. So just to be slightly provocative, I think we cannot really excuse companies that are dodging their taxes. I also believe that we have to be imposing international standards, whether it's for human rights, whether it's for environmental management, that have to be creating a level playing field for businesses wherever they are. And that is why Richard's new job, is ever so important, because that is about measuring how companies create value, to hold them accountable for that, and also to be totally clear about where they may even destroy value. So value is more than financial value. And I think that's an important message to share. So I also recall very vividly the hush in the room in Brussels when there was the statement about the purpose of the company and the shareholder primacy. The way we put it, and here again I will quote my CEO, for saying that social and environmental issues will eventually become financial issues. So even when you speak the language of the financial markets, you have to factor in the stakeholders' perspective. So that is why in the way we choose to do our business, we are guided by a very simple principle. It's called the triple bottom line. It was coined in the mid-90s by John Elkington, Some say it's kind of old-fashioned. For us, it still works. And what it does is that is a way of guiding how we do business in a way to always consider what are the impacts of what we do to people, communities, and to the environment. And then to understand how we can minimize those unwanted impacts and maximize the benefits. And that, in its essence, is very close to what the European Union has defined as a very important element of corporate social responsibility today. So the how we do business is as important as why we are in business and what we do. And so what we did, and I think that can be a good segue to talk about how other companies can do this, is that we included it into the bylaws of the company, the articles of association. So in the clause on the objects of the company, it says explicitly what we are in business to do, to discover, develop, and produce medical pharmaceutical products for treatment for diseases, and this is of course in legal language, so I will not quote that, but the important addition is that the company strives to conduct its business in a way that is financially, environmentally, and socially responsible. So that makes a commitment. That's a very strong commitment communicated to any shareholder or any investor who would like to put their money into our company, for anybody who wants to work with the company, to do business with the company. This is what you can expect of us. So maybe just in conclusion, a short comment to the glossy reports. So I've also done glossy CSR reports in the past. We didn't call them CSR reports, but we had our environmental and social responsibility reports. We even had a triple bottom line report at one point. And I was frustrated by the fact that that report was hailed and earned awards by people like Richard, but it didn't speak to the important stakeholder group that was the investor base, because it was not distributed for the annual general meeting. Well, it was there, they could pick it up if they wanted to eventually, but that's not the point. So that is why back in 2004 we decided to put together into one report our environmental, social, and financial performance statements. That's how today we continue to develop and constantly innovate our integrated reporting. And we did that before anyone had started introducing the term integrated reporting. So I have often heard the statement that you shouldn't expect innovation from incumbents. Well, some might say don't expect innovation from government, from legislation, don't expect innovation from big business. But I would say that there is an inherent drive in some companies, and that's the drive that we need to activate and then to spread it out, because we can be happy that we have a very strong purpose, because that is what defines why every single one of my colleagues goes to work every day. Is not, I can assure you, to create shareholder value. It's to defeat diabetes and other serious chronic diseases. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanne. Before I turn to Marcello, a quick question, and quite a blunt question. We just met, but forgive the boldness of my blunt question. The pharmaceutical industry, as you know, is very much in the firing line, maybe some activist groups, because yes, you are creating these wonderful new treatments, not just your company, I'm talking about the sector more broadly, but there's all the question about pricing. If a car company makes a car that's too expensive, people just don't buy the car. If a chocolate company makes a bar of chocolate that's too expensive, they don't buy the bar of chocolate. When it comes to your industry, of course, it's not quite the same, and rightly or wrongly, and I followed your sector for many, many years as an advisor in my previous lives, and I just find it extraordinary that somehow, despite your commitment, I'm talking now broadly, not about NovoNordisk, commitment to CSR, to triple bottom line to the real, life changing treatments you produce, nonetheless your public image is not particularly good at any given moment. And so do you feel, maybe my question in all that is first of all, that you might want to challenge my interpretation, but more broadly, do you think that it's almost like your sector has to take a leading role in this whole debate, because you are very much, people have different expectations of your sector compared to other sectors? Is that a fair comment?
That is an absolute fair comment, and I think it's also totally to the point. That is at the heart of the discussion around this industry just now. Whether we talk the US, where pricing has been largely up to the industry to determine, whether you talk European countries in which there's healthcare reform, there's a pressure on pricing, whether you talk China. So that is actually back to my point about growing up and becoming one of the leaders, is that we have to take a lead on that. And we have to consider that the notion of pricing is perhaps only the tip of the iceberg, because it really has to do with how do we value the quality of lives of people. So, but it also gives me an occasion to mention something that is clearly also at the heart of this conversation, namely sustainable companies. Because if we want to be a sustainable business, and we have framed it as being in business for the next generations, that means that we rely on a society that is functioning well. And so to your point about the pricing, if there's not a willingness nor an ability to pay for the products that we develop, then we can develop all the most wonderful new innovations in the world. We will not be able to sustain our business. So we have to consider pricing in the context of a society in which there is a pressure on healthcare costs. There is a pressure on priorities. What do we do? Do we invest in climate change adaptation, or do we invest in better health for populations? And these kinds of hard questions we have to be able to be part of.
Okay, thank you very much, Susanne. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but you did an excellent job at responding. Now I turn to, it says here, serial entrepreneur. It does not say also is a good friend of mine, Marcello Palazzi.
Oh, thank you very much, Paul. Good morning, everyone. The hat I'm really wearing is I've co-founded the B Corps in Europe. Richard took the Benefit Corporation in California. Well, the certified B Corps, about 1,950 countries, and there are about 4,000 benefit corporation by law in the United States, Italy, Argentina is coming, Australia and Taiwan, where the legislation has been discussed. So I represent that kind of view. And so I want to also give a little input or feedback to what John Kay said, with great respect. I want to add two things. One is there's a context. So what is the context? The context is this capitalism or a capitalist system that has real challenges. Whether it is the planet, sustainability, whether it is inequalities, it is also the opportunities we are not capturing by maybe not being innovative enough. Certainly speaking from Europe, with my hat as being a fellow at Stanford, if you look at Silicon Valley, they would say that Europe is not innovating enough. So the capitalism needs to be improved, can be improved. And so when John says the business of business is business, absolutely, but there must be a sort of a connection between what society expects, what society needs, and what this business of business is. So there's a question about direction, about where are we going, what are the objectives? Are we developing clean energy? Are we creating more sustainable agriculture, et cetera, what society needs? So I think there is a question for me about, yes, the business of business, absolutely, but in which context? Secondly, it's this question of, you talk about corporations. You said, most CEOs or companies, they have a purpose, fine, but I think we have had a problem with the financial sector. We are still kind of, in a way, being hijacked by the financial sector since the crisis. Even yesterday, this morning, Wells Fargo as being basically cooking the books. So some of these things have happened in the financial sector which have had a repercussion on the actual work of companies. I would say mostly companies in the real economy, whether it is family businesses, whether it is companies that not only the largest companies in the world, and actually as a matter of fact, most economies are made up of small and medium-sized companies, not just the biggest. So we should look at the whole economy, not just the larger companies. This movement called the B Corps, we go from startups all the way to two of the subsidiaries of Unilever, Ben & Jerry, a 7th generation of B Corps. Danone has made an alliance with us to certify as a B Corp in the next 4 years. I think as of yesterday, they certified Danone Spain, which is a $1 billion company, Euro company. And we have, I came from Hong Kong on Sunday. We launched in Asia. There are 50 countries where there is a civil society, need from society to enlarge the potential of what the corporation can do. So it's about the purpose of the corporation. What's also really happening, if I may say also, John, is that you said, companies becoming political, governments have that role. But on the other hand, many people know that governments are not necessarily taking their responsibilities, whether it's climate change or whether it is innovation, other issues. And NGOs have done a lot, but there's also sort of a limit to their power. So is a legitimate question for society if someone is an entrepreneur, is a business leader, and sees an unmet need, or has a particular drive, like James Dyson in the UK. He wanted to create the best Hoover in the world. Society needs to give freedom to these people to do that. Why not? And anyway, people are taking that freedom to do so. So the purpose of the corporation, I think, has to be seen within this wider context of the capitalist system. The fact that there are, thousands or more entrepreneurs and investors, look at the whole impact investing, that actually are really concerned with aligning the corporation and what the corporation does with the wider societal expectations and needs. And maybe finally another point which we had discussed briefly on the phone before we planned this session is that there are a lot of organizations out there that are, I would call them hybrid organizations. They're not necessarily just in the private sector as we understand it, but they are public-private partnerships or social enterprises or new forms. Some in the Netherlands, we have one called Zorg, which is a bottom-up initiative to provide healthcare to patients. So many of these hybrid organizations don't neatly sit in this box of, say, this is the business, only business. So in a nutshell, my message is this is a wider conversation. Also because we have so many more entrepreneurs in the world than we had, at the time of ICI, even 20 years ago. And many developing countries, from Kenya, South Africa, Indonesia, most of the best ideas are coming from entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs. There is a real revolution going on. Many of the millennials in Silicon Valley and so on, they are driven by a real, they're driven by their purpose. And then they say, hey, we want to create a business around that purpose. So I just finished by saying the CEO of Danone, Emmanuel Faber, he basically says, we are not a business with a mission. We are a mission with a business. In other words, hey, here we have a purpose. The purpose may be, we want to create the best telephones in the world, like Steve Jobs would say, or the best computers in the world, and we are going to create, design and organize a business around that purpose. So I think the world is changing. I think there are lots of people out there who have this extended view of the corporation, and I think that the outcome, I was only speaking for the B Corps, 1,900 companies, 50 countries. Amazing things, we have Triodos Bank as a B Corp, they actually have a very different view of finance. So money is not their objective, and what they've been doing for 35 years is very telling how actually a successful bank, because they've been successful when many other banks have failed. Or, we have a company like called Fairphone. Fairphone is the only fair trade telephone company, mobile, all the components are fair trade components. Or Tony Chocolonely, a slave-free chocolate company. So, this is happening. So we should recognize that this is happening and, in a way, create space for more of these purpose-led companies. So that's and maybe very, very finally, I think that my reading of the ICI story that John mentioned, is actually ICI has lost its purpose. It's lost its purpose, and therefore could no longer see what they were in business for. So in a way, what NovoNordisk, I'm a big fan of NovoNordisk, have actually always kept their purpose. And so in a way, we are going back to the same point, and I closed it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcello. You used the phrase governments not taking their responsibilities, and I think you said also that creating a vacuum into which is filled by groups like NGOs. Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing, maybe. People talking about more involvement of civil society in policy making in society. So, and secondly, entrepreneurs, including social entrepreneurs like you, often say we don't want governments to get involved. We just want them to get out of the way so we can carry on being good entrepreneurs. So So when you say the government's not taking responsibility, was that a major criticism or was it more of an observation?
Well, no, I mean, I didn't say that. I mean, I'm absolutely pro-NGO. I mean, there's no question about it. But the NGOs often cannot scale. So the big discussion now is how do you scale some of these social enterprises or NGO activities that do not have a business model. So I go back to John's point. The business model, in that sense, it's absolutely fundamental that these organizations should have a viable business model.
Okay, right.
And governments, absolutely. But the reality is, I don't know if you want to raise hands and ask in the room here, who thinks in this room, let's do it, who thinks in this room that governments are fulfilling their responsibilities in terms of climate change, etc. I mean, I think it's a real question. And this is not, you know, I was in Hong Kong, yes, I was in London. It is not about being in Brussels or being everywhere in the world. I would say that there is a bit of a gap.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you, Marcello. I'm going to open the discussion in a minute to everybody in the room, so be prepared. But before I do, I want to ask John whether you'd like to react in any way to what you've heard from Susanne and Marcello, or even extra thoughts you've had since you made your presentation.
Yeah. There are loads of things there, and I'll only pick up on three that I'm kind of bursting to talk about. One is to say I always valued a statement which was made 2 or 3 centuries ago by an Archbishop of Dublin, who said, honesty may be the best policy, but the man who adopts that policy is not an honest man. And we need to get away from the framework that says that business should behave ethically because it will be profitable in the long run for them to behave ethically. That is not fundamentally the issue. It may be that if Starbucks paid tax on a more realistic basis, that they would have more customers drinking their coffee, and in 50 years, more people would have drunk Starbucks coffee, and Starbucks would have a greater shareholder market capitalization. Or it might not be true. And I don't know the answer to that question, and nor do the people who run Starbucks, and nor does anyone else. Part of the reason shareholder value is the dumbest idea in the world, and this is what Welch said when he made that, one of the things Welch said when he made that statement, is you don't know how to do it. If you say to people, go into your executive office today and maximize shareholder value, what do you do next? And as Susanne said, no one goes to work or goes home in the evening and says, I maximize shareholder value today, I bet the shareholders are pleased. This is not how business actually functions. And that's the deficiency in all of this. And Starbucks should pay tax because people should pay tax. And there isn't anything more to be said about that. And organizations that don't behave in what is an appropriate way to their social context, in the end lose their legitimacy, and that's the very serious problem we have. The second issue, which comes rather directly from that, is you asked for rules, and then we raised questions about what had happened at Wells Fargo and indeed elsewhere in the financial system. And I'm very clear what rule we ought to have there, and it's the rule that says that people who run organizations are prima facie responsible for the behavior of people in that organization. And that's what's needed to make sure that it's not just 5,000 junior employees of Wells Fargo who are fired. It is the people who ran the culture in which they behaved in that way who go to jail or at any rate see their careers ended as a result of this. And despite all this discussion of rules, despite the proliferation of corporate governance rules, we have significantly made no progress on that. In Britain, we actually went as far in 2012 as actually passing legislation that imposed that kind of rule on the financial sector. And in last year, we pulled it after pressure from financial sector lobbies. And that's what I have in mind to say, that actually probably the largest problem we have in our market economies today is not that corporations don't do enough in the political sphere, it's that they do too much, and that we want to get them out of all of this. And if one can take the example there, since it's raised, of James Dyson, I think it's great that he wants to build the greatest vacuum cleaners in the world. I think, and I would give him every encouragement to do so. That's what building great businesses is actually about, and what he has actually achieved. When James Dyson runs a campaign to spend more money on British manufacturing or to take Britain out of the EU, I want to give exactly as much attention to James Dyson as I do to anyone else in Britain who wants to take these particular views. No less, but absolutely no more. And that's, again, part of what I mean by saying the business of business is business, and the business of business people is business.
Okay. Thank you very much, John. And I open it to the audience. Yes, okay. We're going to. We'll take three together. And would you mind? Is there a microphone? If not, and could you sir, in the middle, and maybe stand up and give your name. Your microphone's coming. People. The gentleman standing up. Perfect. Give your name, sir, and organisation, and try and keep your question brief. Or maybe just a comment. It hasn't got to be a question. And then we have two or three more.
My name is Morten Huse. I'm a professor, and I really appreciated the three very different perspectives that you were presenting. And I'm concerned that we may be sticking to something that is just flicking on the core things. I think we should follow what John Kane was also suggesting, that we really need to rethink what the business is, and not doing some of the flicking around, trying to just think about how to do things, and also trying to have some alternative objectives, but really rethink what a business is as the core thing. Because we're seeing that there are lots of things about mimicking. Also, when completely rethinking what a business is, which is business, but we should rethink the whole setting around what it is. That was my main comment. I really appreciated the different perspectives, but we need to go beyond the immediate flicking on some other things being there. And we also need to know that there are tremendous differences across countries on the different concepts you were talking about, and I'm not sure that the different concepts you were talking about really communicates with the outside the local countries you're talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I sense some of these will be comments as much as questions. What I'm going to do, so you all know what's going to happen, I'm going to ask you to make your intervention, all of you, briefly as possible, and then leave the panel to work out which of the questions were questions and which were comments. You, sir, with the glasses and the grey beard, you're going to stand up and then let the person behind him afterwards, and then you all have a say, as long as you're brief.
Thank you. Peter Montagnon from the Institute of Business Ethics in the UK. John, I agree, as always, with almost everything you say, but there's one dimension that you didn't raise, which is competition. And you talked about Apple and Google being great companies. Well, of course they are, but although they don't employ many people, by the way, and they don't pay much tax, but one of the things which I think distinguishes some of these big American high-tech companies is you can see in the business models a desire to make themselves monopolies and give themselves monopoly power. So my question is, can you be a good business if you get into the position of being a monopoly, or indeed if you're trying to? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Pass the microphone to the gentleman behind you. The gentleman, you had your hand up, didn't you, sir? You can't see me, I can see you. Whoever it was, yes, okay.
Thank you.
Please brief as possible.
Certainly, Raj Moss from Preventable Surprises. Love the presentation, John, and the comments. Picking up on our colleague's comment about the intercultural differences, we have now a situation, say, on climate change, where large companies who are doing a lot of good and are part of Ceres and part of BSR and doing all the right things are also funding trade associations which are seeking to actually put back the regulations. So we have the current debate over the Clean Energy Act, heavily supported by the Business Roundtable and the Chamber of Commerce and others. And so I have a question to us is, what should we be expecting from those companies to do? Should they be pulling out of those trade associations? Should they be doing like Google and Microsoft and Amicus Brief? to support it? What's the solution to this problem? And I'm not sure on this occasion, John's right, that we just distance ourselves from the problem because we've helped create the problem.
Okay, thank you, sir. I think somebody behind you, or am I mistaken? No? Okay. So the back of the room, and then you, sir. Somebody right at the back of the room, gentleman in the back row, and then the gentleman in the front row.
Paul Dickinson, CDP. Just to echo Raj's point, sustainability is the name we give to problems government can't fix. Right now, business is stopping, government's responding to climate change. Surely that's the #1 threat, literally, in the world.
Thank you, sir. It was brief, wonderful. And gentleman in the front row, making the lady run with the microphone. It always happens that way, doesn't it? And then you, sir. And you.
Thank you. My name is Devon Owen. I have a question for Mr. John Kay. At the end of your speech, you said one important thing for yourself. You said it's very important that we engage much more in education. Could you please tell us a bit more about that, and especially education of boards?
Thank you. Pass the microphone, sir, to Stefan on your left, right.
Stefan Stern. Hello, John. A question for you about the 2006 Companies Act in the UK and this phrase, the company and its members. And I just wonder whether you could amplify a little what you understand by the word members in that context.
Thank you, Stefan. Any more questions? Right in the back. Did that on purpose. Go back to the back row again, please. Lady with her hand up. And then you, so then we have to call it a day.
Thank you.
Please
Joy
stand up.
Wasaki
Yeah,
from
thank you.
ACCA. My question is about companies that are trying to be sustainable in the context of wider economy. Do companies actually benefit from being, following the sustainable model? And in that case, why other companies are not doing? And if economy as a whole is not particularly geared towards that sort of economic model, what is the advantage or disadvantage that those companies might suffer?
Thank you, madam. And then gentleman here, and then we finish. Back to the second row, please. And then we go back to the panel.
Good morning. It's Dick Baker, Keras Consulting and Future Considerations. I truly believe that education, that, as opposed to rules point you make, John, or I wish to believe it. But my question is around what else do we need? Because the rules and the norms seem to be a bit agnostic at the moment. So they don't force one to be good or bad, actually. We know that. And in Susan's example, they've chosen the triple bottom line and they've chosen to put it into their articles. Of course, it could be changed at any time with those who have the voting rights. So my question is, what role do rules have to play? B Corp, for example, bakes it into the law. So what role do rules have to play?
Thank you. So that's a very rich Q&A, my goodness me. So we have about 3 minutes, a minute each. I think John had rather more questions posed to him. So maybe 2 minutes, 1 minute, and then Jerome. So John, you had a number of questions addressed to you.
Right.
Please be brief.
Competition, Apple and Google, that's genuinely difficult. You know, I think if companies become monopolies because they produce products that everyone wants to buy, it is very difficult to criticize them for being monopolies in that situation. One has to observe in that situation, however, that either they continue to do that or they discover that their monopoly starts to fray at the edges, which is kind of exactly the problem Apple now has, and perhaps Google will at some time in the future. I know a lot of people that are going to find this difficult, but I think if I want to believe that companies should be out of politics, I believe they should be out of politics whether they're expressing views that I agree with or not. And if I believe that companies should not be spending money funding bogus research against climate change, I also have to believe, I think, that companies are not entitled to lobby in the other direction either. I think the less lobbying, we need a lot less lobbying from the part of corporations of any kind. And if that means that taking corporations out of some activities which I rather wish they should engage in, that's a price which we need to recognize and pay. As far as education is concerned, I think the largest area of education probably starts with educating boards about what company law actually is. As I said already, I haven't encountered many directors who knew what the 2006 Companies Act says. that it is to promote the success of the company for the benefit of the members. And frankly, I have no doubt that members in that sense means shareholders, but that's the way round it is, that it's the success of the company for the benefit of the members.
I'm going to have to cut you off.
I've even heard frequently recently companies say, people on boards say there's a fiduciary duty to minimize tax, which there plainly is not, and so on.
I'm going to have to cut you off, John, so
One
please hurry up. Yeah.
one more observation, which is to say that we've talked a bit about the financial sector, and understanding what has gone wrong there is in part key, which is that in the financial sector we are seeing companies that are run not for the benefit of their shareholders, but for the benefit of the senior employees of these companies. And that's the essence of the problem there, and that is where the shareholder value debate ultimately leads you. And we need to recognize that that is what has undermined that particular position more than anything else.
Thank you very much, John. Marcello, quickly then.
Two things. So, Raj's question about lobbying. So, I give you what we do within the B Corp movement. You become a B Corp, you have to disclose, completely transparent about what you do. So, on the internet, you can go in, bcorporation.net, you can see all the companies and what they do, what they disclose. Similar to this question here about what more to do, in this B Corp world, companies have to there are 200 indicators you have to actually answer from governance, stakeholders, business model, etc. So it's a way to measure. We start measuring, and it's also not just a measurement from the outside, it becomes a management tool, very active actually to run your company. And final point on the question at the end from the lady, we made a study like 2 weeks ago, well actually some professor made a study, 700 B Corps to see whether they were more profitable or less, and the outcome is there is no cost in actually being sustainable. Most companies were either more profitable or as profitable as normal companies that were not sustainable. So, and there's a lot of evidence from the banking world for impact investors that that is the case.
Thank you very much, Marcello. The last word, but the brief last word to Susanne.
Well, just picking up from your point, it's clear that we all look for the causality of the links between being a responsible or sustainable business and being profitable and being there in the long term. I think it's probably difficult for us to find that causality, but what we can find is the correlation. But I want to just make one point, is to say there's no point in being a sustainable business if the society in which we operate is going more unsustainable. So that is why it is in the interest of any business leader to actually contribute to making the society in which it operates more sustainable. Then, if I may just say on the lobbying and the political discussion, I think those are pertinent questions that need to be addressed. And I suggest that we ask Frank Bold to host another conference that is dedicated to this, because this is too important to just have at the back of a panel here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, a round of applause. I think you will agree that's been an extraordinary, deep, profound, interesting, stimulating conversation, enhanced by your participation towards the end. With huge apologies to Jerome, who'll go eating into his speaking time, but maybe he in turn will eat into our eating time at lunchtime. So I now give the floor to Jerome Belmano, Senior Research Fellow at the Cass Business School. Thank you, Jerome.
Thank you.